History is made out of the combination of various sources. But what happens when you have only one? What happens when an entire time period in a specific geographical region is enshrouded by darkness and lit only by one single person? Can we trust what this historian has to say? Can we, through his bias, understand his time period? Today, we'll get to know one of these torchbearers of history, Gregory of Tours, the man who alone wrote the history of the first kings of France, the Merovingians. Gregory of Tours is in many ways the father of Merovingian history, the Herodotus of France, we could say. His Historia Francorum, the history of the Franks, is our single most important source for the early Merovingian period, covering the collapse of the Roman rule in Gaul, the rise of Clovis, first king of France, and the violent, treacherous world of the Frankish ruling family. The Historia Francorum, while extremely important, is deeply flawed, a both contradictory and biased account that reflects Gregory's own worldview far more than it does an objective history. And yet, it is the only one, so we have to rely on it. So who was Gregory of Tours? To understand the Historia Francorum, we need to understand him. He was born in 538 AD into a family of Gallo-Roman aristocrats in the city of Clermont. This was a time of immense upheaval. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed just a few decades earlier, and the Franks, once just one of the many Germanic tribes on the empire's borders, had seized control of the whole of Gaul, ancient France, under their king, Clovis. Gregory grew up in a world where Roman identity still lingered, but was rapidly being reshaped by the rule of barbarian kings. Most of what we know about Gregory's life comes from his own writings. He was well educated, having trained under his uncle Gallus, the bishop of Clermont. He entered the clergy and by 573 AD had risen to become Bishop of Tours, one of the most important religious centers in Merovingian Gaul. Tours was home of the shrine of San Martin, one of the most venerated saints of all time, and Gregory saw himself as Martin's devoted servant. This was not just a religious matter. Being Bishop of Tours also meant wielding a considerable amount of political influence. Gregory frequently interacted with the Merovingian kings and nobles, and his writings reflect the concerns of a churchman navigating the brutal world of Frankish politics. Despite its title, Historia Francorum is not a conventional history in the modern sense. Gregory was not trying to create a neutral, factual record of events. His goal was moral, religious, and deeply personal. He wrote his history to demonstrate the role of divine providence in human affairs, to glorify the power of saints, especially Saint Martin, and to provide a moral guide for rulers and bishops. This perspective shapes every part of this narrative. Miracles and divine interventions are common, with God rewarding the faithful and punishing the wicked. Saints appear frequently, performing miracles, healing the sick, and intervening in earthly affairs. Gregory does not present these as legends or exaggerations. He believes them as absolutely real. And I know what you're thinking. Of course he does, he's a bishop. But you'd be surprised about how many bishops are extremely tied to the material world in their writings. Now, Gregory's moral outlook extends also to how he portrays key political figures. Kings who support the church and act as defenders of Christianity are presented in a positive light, even if they are ruthless killers. Those who oppose the church, or who Gregory personally dislikes, are shown as wicked, doomed to failure, or struck down by divine punishment. This means that his depictions of key figures, like Clovis or Queen Fredegund, are heavily shaped by his personal biases. So, what does the Historia Francorum actually say? It is divided in various books. Book 1, gives us the foundations of the world. Gregory begins his history not with the Franks, but with the creation of the world itself. Like many medieval writers, he saw history as a continuation of biblical events. He recounts the story of Adam and Eve, the Great Flood, and the patriarchs of the Old Testament. This is followed by a brief history of the Roman Empire, with a strong focus on Christian rulers like Constantine, whom Gregory views as divinely chosen. He then introduces Saint Martin of Tours, the most important religious figure in the text. Gregory describes Martin's miracles, his ability to heal the sick, cast out demons, and even raise the dead. To Gregory, Martin is not just a saint, he is an active force in history, shaping events centuries after his death. The second book tells the rise of the Franks and the reign of Clovis. Gregory presents the Franks as chosen people, rising to power under their first king, Clovis. But this account of Clovis is filled with contradictions. On one hand, Clovis is portrayed as a warrior chosen by God to lead the Franks to glory. Gregory emphasizes his conversion to Christianity, recounting how Clovis called upon Christ during the Battle of Tolbiac, and after his victory, agreed to be baptized by Saint Remigius. This moment is depicted as a turning point, with Clovis leading the Franks away from their pagan past and into Christian salvation. But Gregory also describes Clovis as a ruthless, calculating figure who systematically eliminates all of his rivals. He tells the story of how Clovis had Sigibert of Cologne assassinated, then murdered the man who carried out the killing to erase all traces of his involvement. He recounts how Clovis deceived and killed Ragnachar, a fellow Frankish king, before seizing his lands. In one of the most chilling moments, Gregory had Clovis himself reflect on his own bloodshed, lamenting that he has no more relatives left to eliminate. Yet Gregory never condemns him for this. His role as the first Christian king of the Franks outweighs his brutal methods. But he does right them. In Book 3, the civil war begins. With Clovis dead, his kingdom is divided among his 4 sons, Theodoric, Clodomer, Childebert, and Clotaire. Gregory describes a world descending into chaos, as these brothers turn against each other, murdering rivals and waging war over the kingdom's spoils. The most infamous event of this period is the assassination of Clodomer's sons, after Clodomer is killed in battle. His mother, Queen Clotilde, tries to protect her grandsons, but Clotaire and Childebert see them as threats. They send a message demanding that the boys either become monks or die. When the children refuse to take monastic vows, Clotaire takes the matter into his own hands. The fact that Gregory records this with a mix of horror and fascination, not presenting the king as evil, just as part of the brutal world of the Frankish politics, tells a lot about the world he was inhabiting. By the 4th and 5th book, the Merovingian kingdom is ruled by a new generation of kings, and Gregory introduces 2 of the most infamous figures of his history, Queen Brunhild and Queen Fredegund. These 2 women dominate the middle section of Historia Francorum, locked in a decades-long struggle for power that results in countless assassinations, betrayals, and wars. Brunhild, a Visigothic princess, marries King Sigibert of Austrasia and attempts to bring Roman-style administration to her new kingdom. But her rival, Fredegund, rises from the rank of servant to become the wife of Sigibert's brother, King Chilperic of Neustria. The 2 women hate each other with a passion, and Gregory spares no details in describing the chaos they unleash. Fredegund orchestrates the assassination of Brunhild's husband, Sigibert, and forces Brunhild into exile. Brunhild, however, fights back, plotting the deaths of Fredegund's allies and securing power for her own descendants. By Book 6, the Historia Francorum transitions from the past to the present. and Gregory's own experiences. He becomes a first-hand witness to the violent politics of Merovingian Gaul, from a secondary source to a primary source. His writings become more detailed and personal. He describes the rule of King Chilperic I, whom he calls the Nero and Herod of our time, portraying him as a tyrant who oppresses the church and murders rivals. Gregory himself has several run-ins with Chilperic and barely avoids being accused of treason. The narrative is filled with assassination attempts, rebellions, and divine punishments. In one particularly dramatic passage, Gregory describes how Chilperic is mysteriously struck and dies in agony, a clear sign in Gregory's eyes of God's judgment. The final two books cover the reign of King Guntram, one of the few rulers Gregory seems to genuinely admire. Guntram is portrayed as a just and pious king, defending the church and protecting his people. But the chaos of Merovingian politics does not end. Fredegund continues her bloody path, and Brunhild seeks revenge for years of humiliation. Gregory's last chapters are a mix of history, personal reflection, and a religious vision. He expresses his deep frustration with the state of the world, lamenting the sinfulness of the kings and nobles. But he also ends on a hopeful note, reaffirming his belief that God's justice will ultimately prevail. Gregory's moral framework is of extreme interest. He does not require consistency. As long as your actions and belief help the cause of Christianity, everything is permitted. Both Clovis and Fredegund, the king and the queen, are ruthless killers, and yet both are admired by Gregory for different reasons. For all its contradictions and biases, Historia Francorum is an invaluable source. Without Gregory, we would know almost nothing about the early Merovingian period, but relying on him comes with a serious challenge. His account is incomplete, inaccurate, shaped by religious concerns, and we also have to consider what Gregory chose to include and what he left out. His focus was on kings, bishops, and saints, meaning the vast aspects of Merovingian society, such as the lives of ordinary people, the economic structure, the cultural developments, are barely mentioned. His narrative is centered on political and religious elites, with little concern for anything outside of that sphere. Moreover, Gregory's Historia Francorum is not even a finished work. He wrote it over several decades, updating and expanding it as events unfolded. This means that later sections are more detailed than earlier parts, as Gregory was recording events closer to his own time. His account of Clovis and the earlier kings is based on second-hand stories and oral traditions. We of course help ourselves with archaeology and cultural studies to try and understand the France at the time, but Gregory remains our main source. There is no way around Gregory of Tours. One needs to accept him as the only source, as the Herodotus of early France. This is just one example of the types of bottlenecks one faces in trying to understand history from the sources at the core. So when we look at the early Merovingian period, when we look at France at the time, we need to remember we are not looking at an objective history. We are looking through the eyes and the writings of Gregory of Tours. I hope you enjoyed this little stroll in the weird world of historical sources, and I'll see you soon. Have a good one.